going to read the first 37 verses of the chapter. John 11, verses 1 through 37. Let's ask God to bless the reading. Dear God, send your Holy Spirit into this place, that the words will come off the page, then to our ears, and then into our hearts. Amen. John 11. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" This is the word of the Lord. What happens when you cry? Exactly. A salty fluid chock full of protein, water, mucus, and oil is released from the lacrimal gland in the upper outer region of your eye. This fluid, better known as tears, then flows down the surface of your eye, across your face, and smears your mascara. 3 types of tears exist, all with different purposes. Basal tears are omnipresent in the eye. These constant tears are what keep our eyes from drying out completely. The second type is reflex tears, which serve to protect the human eye from harsh irritants such as smoke, onions, or even a strong, dusty wind. The third type of tears is emotional tears. It all starts in the cerebrum, where sadness is registered. The endocrine system is then triggered to release hormones to the ocular area, which then causes tears to form. The phrase, having a good cry, suggests that crying can actually make you feel physically and emotionally better. And all this from a website aptly called How Things Work. Hey, I did my research. During these weeks of Lent, we've been looking at this third category of tears, the emotional tears. And this morning our focus is on verse 35 of the story we just read. It's a verse that shows up all the time in Bible trivia, right? What's the shortest verse in the Bible? Jesus wept. In those 2 words, actually it's 3 in the Greek, but we'll just say 2, we go far beyond trivia. We go to the deepest place of the human condition. Jesus wept. And those tears really can make you physically and emotionally better. Those tears. Lazarus, it says, had just died, and he'd been in the tomb already for 4 days. Any of you who have gone through such a time of loss, you know that those first few days after death, you move around in this kind of fog. With all the details of planning a funeral, you hardly have a moment to think. And then besides that, many people, if you are from a church family such as this, many people are holding you up in prayer during a time like that. But after the funeral, well, that's a different story. That's when the grief can be so overwhelming. And it's at this point that Jesus arrives in Bethany. So tears can be expected. Lazarus was a dear friend. Jesus loved him. And his heart breaks for his sisters, Martha and Mary. You know, we often will read this verse as what you might call a proof text for Jesus' humanity, which is a good thing. It's an important thing. The Heidelberg Catechism spends a lot of time talking about the fact that Jesus was both a person and God. Question answer 16. Why must the mediator be a true and righteous human? This is before they've even named that the mediator is Jesus. Why must the mediator be a true and righteous human? And the answer is that God's justice demands it. That human nature, which has sinned, must pay for sin. Historically, people have swung back and forth like a pendulum in emphasizing either the godly nature of Jesus or his humanity. And I would say that today, in our secular world, the balance is tipped towards Jesus being a good person. He's a good person, people will tell you. But God, okay, let's not go overboard here. He was a good person. In our circles within the church, we probably err in the other direction. We have a little trouble getting our heads around the fact that Jesus was, for example, tempted in every way that you and I are. A number of years ago, there was a big uproar about a movie called The Last Temptation of Christ. That film depicts the life of Jesus Christ and his struggle with various forms of temptation, including fear and doubt and depression and reluctance and lust. And we go, yeah, whoa, lust? Yeah, lust too. Read Hebrews 4, verse 15. Tempted in every way. This passage then in John 11 gives us a glimpse of Jesus' humanity. And so we can see in our mind's eye Jesus weeping silently. His head is bowed and a tear is running down his cheek. When I Googled images of Jesus wept to put on my blog, that's what the pictures all look like. A sad, sad man with his head bowed. It's the picture in my mind, and I'm going to guess it's the same picture that's in yours. But you know what? It's not very accurate. If we have a look at verse 33, there comes our first clue. It says there that Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Now that's a very gentle interpretation of the original Greek. A whole lot of commentators, starting already with Luther, think that is not a very accurate way of putting that piece. Schnackenberg, I think that's how you pronounce his name, following Luther, says that the word used here indicates an outburst of anger, and any attempt to reinterpret it in terms of an internal emotional upset caused by grief, pain, or sympathy is illegitimate. Secondly, in a culture of hired mourners, silent weeping would have been unheard of, if you'll excuse the pun. And thirdly, I refer to the word that Frederick Bruner uses to translate this verse. This from his commentary on the Gospel of John. Rather than Jesus wept, he says, Jesus bawled. You know, the picture that I eventually used on my blog to describe this bawling was of a Peanuts character. I think it's Sally. And, you know, she's got her head thrown back and her mouth is wide open and the tears are coming out of her head like that. Probably more accurate. These tears then were much more than tears of sadness and grief and sympathy. They were an expression of something much deeper. Jesus' anguish, says Bruner, comes from the agony that death brings to people. The world's and the church's anguish in the experience of death breaks Jesus' heart. Jesus cried then tears of anger and regret and frustration. He bawled over the human condition and all the damage it was causing. And rather than gently patting Mary or Martha's back, he may have been looking up to heaven with his fists clenched at his side. Some of you know what it is to bawl, to wail aloud. 15 or 16 years ago, I had something happening with my right breast. Not an actual lump, but something was off, something was not right. And so I finally went to my family doctor, and after a quick exam, he said he wanted to consult a specialist. Wait here, he said. But he couldn't get the specialist on the phone right away. Please wait, he said to me. And so I'm sitting in this little examination room, and you know what that's like, right? You start checking out the blood pressure machine, and you weigh yourself 3 times, and he kept coming back and saying, please wait. And I started to get concerned. After 3 or 4 times asking me to wait, I asked why I couldn't just go home. I said, I promise I'll stay by the phone. And so with some reservation, he let me go, but he asked me, stay by the phone. And soon after I got home, the specialist did call. She wanted to see me right away. And so I was x-rayed rather than given a mammogram because my condition was such that they weren't going to subject me to that kind of torture. She did some other tests and then told me that they were checking for something called inflammatory breast cancer. So I went home and Googled it. That's what we do, right? Even then, 15 years ago. Inflammatory breast cancer progresses rapidly, often in a matter of weeks or months. At diagnosis, inflammatory breast cancer is either stage 3 or 4. Because inflammatory breast cancer usually develops quickly and spreads aggressively to other parts of the body, women diagnosed with this disease in general do not survive as long as women diagnosed with other types of breast cancer. Well, and over the next couple of months, I had a couple of surgeries where they lanced the breast. And the public health nurse came to our house every day, where upstairs in my bedroom she packed the wound, often while my family was at the supper table. And I had a lot of doctor's visits. And they eventually ruled out IBC, but they wanted to keep an eye on things. You know, I never during that time thought that my life was over. I figured God had a lot for me to do yet. I still had 4 sons at home, and Gerald and I had talked about how God was sending me into the ministry. I knew there were good things to come. And I knew I was going to be okay. And yet I recall driving home from one of those hospital appointments that I wept. No, I'd say I wailed. I bawled. Really bawled. And I'm sure that the people in the cars beside me at the stoplight could hear me. And it wasn't because I was sad so much or in pain, and those things were there too, but it was deeper. It was frustration, it was anger, it was the unknown, it was fear. I think I bawled on some level over the same things that Jesus bawled. Over the enormity of it. Over the human condition which could place a woman, me, and my husband and my kids in this situation. Years later, our son Brad told me just how afraid he had been. As a family, I know that we should have talked more openly about what was happening. Jesus also knew that it was going to be okay that day in Bethany. He had said to his disciples, and this is from John 11, verse 11, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I'm going there to wake him up." In verse 40, later in the chapter, Jesus says, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" Now, if you're not familiar with the rest of this story, spoiler alert, I heard a whole bunch of you turning the page when I stopped at verse 37. Jesus does bring Lazarus back to life right then and there. Not at the final resurrection, right then and there. Lazarus walks out of the grave. Jesus knew the outcome. And yet he wept. No, he bawled. He bawled over the enormity of this event. And over the enormity of the event that was still to come. John, the writer of this gospel, presents this story, the raising of Lazarus, as the last of his miracles, the last of his signs that Jesus did while on earth. In the Gospel of John, miracles are always called signs. They point to something or something other than themselves. And so in this case, this final sign, the biggest, the most amazing, this final sign brings to a climax all that preceded it. And in the very next chapter, we find the events of Palm Sunday and the events that lead up to Jesus' arrest. The raising of Lazarus brings us to the biggest event of all history, of all time. God would be glorified through through the death and resurrection of Jesus and the glorifying of his Son, through God's exalting him to sit at his right hand. Do you hear the echoes? The beginning of the Gospel of John, for those of you who are familiar with the prologue, John 1, verse 14. Do you hear them? The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And now, if you believe, you will see the glory of God. Jesus wept, even though he knew the end of the story, that Lazarus would be okay. He wept. He bawled because he knew how big this was. He knew the depth of the pain of the human condition. He knew and felt the tragedy of the human situation. And he knew what awaited him as he resolutely set his face for Jerusalem, to use the words of Luke 9. There's much comfort in this little verse. Jesus wept. In his humanity, Jesus understands the depth of the pain, the depth of our pain when we bawl our eyes out in the privacy of our cars or our bedrooms or our gravesides. But there's also hope. When Jesus wept, he felt the weight of what he was about to do, and that was to set in motion the events through which every one of our tears would be wiped away. Blessed are the heartbroken, for they are the persons who will be comforted. Jesus' second beatitude in Matthew 5. Blessed are you who are weeping now, for you will laugh. Jesus' third beatitude in Luke 6. You will be comforted. You will laugh again. It's a promise. The phrase, then, have a good cry, suggests that crying can actually make you feel physically and emotionally better. Researchers believe that emotional crying is the body's way of ridding itself of toxins and waste products. That's also from that website, How It Works, How Things Work. Jesus had a good cry that day. Not an easy cry, not a gentle cry. He wept for Martha, he wept for Mary, he wept for Lazarus and for all those people from Jerusalem who was there, and he wept for us. The tired mom, the depressed teen, the lonely widow. He wept for you in your disappointment, in your questions, your fear. He wept for us in our regrets, in our hurts, and our struggles. Those tears will make us better, physically, emotionally, and spiritually.
Amen.
Already now, but also into eternity. Those tears were for us. Listen, the teacher is here and is asking for you. He's asking for you. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, you bore the awesome weight of sin. And in your tears, we discover the power of the cross. And in that power, we stand forgiven. We thank you. Amen. Just a reminder that after we sing the song, "Oh, to See the Dawn," one more candle will be extinguished as we approach Good Friday, and also the coffee social at my house. Please rise. Jesus wept. And a little of the light which had come into the world was snuffed out. People of God, receive his blessing. May the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort comfort you in all your troubles. And may you in turn comfort those in any trouble with the comfort you have received from God. Amen.